The Red Square lies bathed in the pale light of dawn, May 24, 1945. Victory banners flutter against the Kremlin walls as captured Nazi standards are hurled onto the cobblestones in a symbolic act of triumph. The Soviet Union stands victorious, its armies having carved a path from Stalingrad to Berlin. But beneath the celebration, a different battle is about to begin, one that will consume the very men who engineered this victory. At the apex of Soviet power sits a circle of leaders who have shepherded their nation through its darkest hour. Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary whose iron will has guided the war effort. Vyacheslav Molotov, the diplomat who negotiated with Hitler and Roosevelt alike. Lavrentiy Beria, the security chief whose NKVD enforced Stalin's will through terror. Georgie Malinkov, the party administrator who managed the war economy. Nikita Kruev, the regional leader who defended Ukraine. Alexei Kosygin, the industrial manager who relocated entire factories eastward. Andrei Zhdanov, the ideologist who maintained party orthodoxy through siege and battle. These men have shared the burden of leadership through humanity's most destructive conflict. Yet within a decade, most would be dead, disgraced, or stripped of power. Their fates reveal the brutal mechanics of Soviet succession, where yesterday's comrades become tomorrow's enemies, and where survival depends not on wartime heroism, but on navigating the treacherous currents of post-war politics. This examination traces the destinies of Stalin's inner circle from their moment of supreme triumph in 1945 through the transformations that would reshape the Soviet Union. Their stories illuminate the price of proximity to absolute power and the institutional forces that consumed even those who helped build the system that would ultimately destroy them. Stalin. From wartime leader to absolute dictator. From the rugged hills of Georgia, Joseph Stalin emerged as the architect of Soviet victory. Born in 1878 to a cobbler's family, his early life of poverty and rebellion forged a relentless drive that propelled him to the pinnacle of power. Joseph Stalin entered the post-war period as perhaps the most powerful man on earth. As Supreme Commander of the Red Army and Chairman of the State Defense Committee, he had personally overseen the Soviet Union's transformation from near defeat in 1941 to total victory in 1945. But Stalin's greatest triumphs lay not behind him but ahead. In the immediate aftermath of victory, Stalin moved swiftly to consolidate Soviet control over Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, he had extracted crucial concessions from Roosevelt and Churchill regarding Poland, Hungary, and other liberated territories. Now he set about implementing his vision of a Soviet sphere of influence that would stretch from the Baltic to the Balkans. The years 1945 to 1948 saw Stalin orchestrate what Winston Churchill would famously call the descent of an Iron Curtain across Europe. In Poland, the communist-dominated provisional government was installed despite Western protests. Hungary saw its democratic parties systematically eliminated after the 1947 elections. Czechoslovakia fell to communist control in February 1948 through what became known as the Prague coup. East Germany was transformed into the German Democratic Republic under Soviet tutelage. Domestically, Stalin faced the monumental task of rebuilding a nation devastated by war. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens had perished, entire cities lay in ruins, and industrial capacity had been decimated. Stalin's response was characteristically brutal and efficient. The Fourth Five-Year Plan, launched in 1946, prioritized heavy industry and military production over consumer goods. Millions of German prisoners of war and displaced persons were employed as forced labor in reconstruction efforts. The Soviet nuclear program, begun during the war under Igor Kurchudov's direction, became Stalin's personal obsession. When the United States demonstrated its atomic capability at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin reportedly told his advisors, "Hiroshima has shaken the whole world. The balance has been destroyed." He ordered an acceleration of Soviet nuclear research, telling Kurchudov, "Ask for whatever you like, you won't be refused." On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. Stalin's paranoia, always present, intensified dramatically in his final years. The Leningrad Affair of 1949 to 1950 saw him order the execution of numerous party officials he suspected of disloyalty, including Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky. The Doctor's Plot of 1952 to 1953, in which prominent Jewish physicians were accused of planning to assassinate Soviet leaders, revealed the extent of his growing anti-Semitism and suspicion. The cult of Stalin's personality reached unprecedented heights during this period. His 70th birthday in December 1949 was celebrated with massive parades, countless tributes, and the presentation of gifts from around the communist world. Cities, factories, and collective farms bore his name. His image appeared on posters, stamps, and currency throughout the Soviet sphere. Yet Stalin remained increasingly isolated, governing from his dacha outside Moscow and trusting virtually no one. He deliberately played his subordinates against each other, ensuring that no potential successor could emerge. Lavrentiy Beria controlled the secret police, Georgie Malinkov managed party affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov handled foreign policy, and Nikita Kruev oversaw agriculture, but none were permitted real autonomy. On March 1, 1953, Stalin suffered a stroke while alone in his study. His bodyguards, under strict orders never to disturb him, waited hours before entering. When they finally found him collapsed on the floor, precious time had been lost. Stalin died 4 days later, on March 5, 1953, leaving behind a power vacuum that would reshape the Soviet Union and the world. Lavrentiy Beria, the executioner's rise and fall. Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria was perhaps the most feared man in Stalin's inner circle, and his fate after Stalin's death would prove that even the most powerful could fall with shocking swiftness. As head of the NKVD from 1938 and later the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Beria had orchestrated mass deportations, supervised the Gulag system, and overseen the Soviet nuclear program. His rise to power had been built on terror, and terror would ultimately destroy him. Born in Georgia in 1899, Beria had worked his way up through the Georgian Communist Party apparatus before catching Stalin's attention in the 1930s. His appointment as NKVD chief in 1938 came at the height of the Great Terror, and he immediately set about reforming the security apparatus, which often meant executing his predecessors' appointees and installing his own loyalists. During World War II, Beria's power expanded exponentially. He organized the mass deportation of entire ethnic groups suspected of collaboration with the Germans, including Chechens, Ingush, and Crimean Tatars. Over 400,000 people were loaded into cattle cars and shipped to Central Asia and Siberia in operations that Beria personally supervised. He also oversaw the execution of Polish officers at Katyn in 1940, a crime that would remain officially denied by the Soviet Union for decades. Perhaps most significantly, Stalin entrusted Beria with the Soviet atomic bomb project in 1945. Given the codename Task No. 1, the nuclear program received unlimited resources and priority. Beria assembled teams of captured German scientists, employed thousands of Gulag prisoners as laborers, and established entire secret cities dedicated to uranium enrichment and weapons production. When the first Soviet atomic bomb was successfully tested in 1949, Beria received the Order of Lenin and was hailed as a hero of socialist labor. But Beria was also planning for a post-Stalin world. Unlike other Politburo members who seemed content to remain forever in Stalin's shadow, Beria quietly built his own power base within the security apparatus. He maintained detailed files on all senior party officials, creating a web of blackmail and leverage that he believed would protect him when the succession struggle began. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, initially seemed to vindicate Beria's strategy. Within hours of the announcement, he had merged the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of State Security under his control, giving him command over all Soviet security forces. He was one of the 3 senior leaders, along with Malinkov and Molotov, who formed the initial collective leadership. Beria immediately began implementing reforms that shocked his colleagues. He ordered the release of the doctors arrested in the Doctor's Plot, publicly admitting that the charges had been fabricated. He freed thousands of Gulag prisoners and proposed reducing the camp system. Most controversially, he suggested allowing greater autonomy for non-Russian republics and even hinted at reunifying Germany under neutral status. These proposals terrified his Politburo colleagues, who saw them as attempts to build popularity and consolidate power. More alarming still was Beria's control over the security apparatus and the compromising information he possessed about all of them. Nikita Khrushchev later recalled, "We were afraid of Beria, he knew too much about all of us." Led by Khrushchev, a conspiracy formed to remove Beria. The plotters knew they had to act quickly and decisively. On June 26, 1953, during what Beria believed would be a routine presidium meeting, he was suddenly confronted by his colleagues and accused of being an enemy of the people. Before he could react, military officers entered the room and arrested him. The charges against Beria read like a catalogue of Soviet paranoia, treason, terrorism, and counter-revolutionary activity. Most luridly, he was accused of being a British spy and of personally murdering Soviet citizens. A secret trial was held in December 1953, presided over by Ivan Konev. The outcome was never in doubt. On December 23, 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was executed by firing squad. With his death, the era of unchecked secret police power came to an end. The security apparatus was reorganized, with the new KGB placed under strict party control. Beria's name was erased from official histories, his photographs removed from archives, and his role in Soviet nuclear development minimized. Georgie Malinkov. The technocrat's brief moment. Georgie Maximilianovich Malinkov represented a different type of Soviet leader, the technocratic administrator who rose through competence rather than charisma or terror. His brief tenure as Stalin's initial successor illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of reform within the Soviet system. Born in 1902 into a middle-class family, Malinkov joined the Communist Party in 1920 and studied electrical engineering before entering party work full-time. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was never a revolutionary fighter or Civil War veteran. Instead, he built his career through organizational skill and loyalty to Stalin, working in the party apparatus throughout the 1920s and 1930s. During World War II, Malinkov served on the State Defense Committee, coordinating aircraft production and later overseeing the evacuation and reconstruction of Soviet industry. His efficiency in these roles earned Stalin's trust, and by the war's end, he had become one of the dictator's closest advisors. He was instrumental in the post-war purge of the Leningrad Group in 1949 to 1950, helping to eliminate potential rivals within the party hierarchy. When Stalin died on March 5, 1953, Malinkov seemed best positioned to succeed him. He was named both chairman of the Council of Ministers, head of government, and senior secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee. For a brief moment, it appeared that Stalin's mantle would pass smoothly to his chosen successor. Malinkov's vision for the Soviet Union differed markedly from Stalin's final years. He advocated for what he called a new course, increased production of consumer goods, reduced agricultural taxes, and a more peaceful foreign policy. In August 1953, he declared that nuclear war would mean the destruction of world civilization, a stark departure from traditional Soviet rhetoric about the inevitability of capitalist collapse. Domestically, Malinkov pushed for economic reforms that would improve living standards. He proposed reducing investments in heavy industry in favor of consumer goods production, arguing that socialism should demonstrate its superiority through abundance rather than just military might. Collective farmers were allowed to expand their private plots, and food prices were reduced through government subsidies. These policies initially proved popular with the Soviet population, which had endured decades of sacrifice in the name of industrialization and war preparation. For the first time since the 1920s, ordinary Soviet citizens could envision a future focused on their material well-being rather than just state power. However, Malinkov made a crucial strategic error early in his tenure. In March 1953, he resigned from the party secretariat to focus on his government role, believing that control of the state apparatus would be sufficient. This decision allowed Nikita Khrushchev to become first secretary of the Communist Party, a position that would prove far more important than Malinkov had anticipated. Khrushchev systematically built support within the party apparatus while Malinkov focused on government policy. The party secretary's control over personnel appointments and ideological direction gave him significant advantages in the emerging power struggle. By 1954, it was clear that real power in the Soviet system still flowed through the party, not the government. The crisis came in early 1955 when Malinkov was forced to admit that his economic policies had failed to meet their targets. Agricultural production had not increased as promised, and the shift toward consumer goods had created bottlenecks in industrial production. His opponents within the Presidium, led by Khrushchev, seized on these failures to demand his resignation. On February 8, 1955, Malinkov submitted his resignation as chairman of the Council of Ministers, accepting blame for insufficient experience in local work and insufficient knowledge of agriculture. He was replaced by Nikolai Bulganin, a Khrushchev ally, though he remained in the Presidium as a minister. Malinkov's fall was not complete, however. He retained significant influence and in 1957 joined with Vyacheslav Molotov and Lazar Kaganovich in what became known as the Anti-Party Group, an attempt to remove Khrushchev from power. The conspiracy initially succeeded in obtaining a Presidium majority against Khrushchev, but the first secretary outmaneuvered them by appealing to the broader Central Committee. When the Central Committee supported Khrushchev, the conspirators were branded as anti-party elements and expelled from the Presidium. Malinkov was demoted to director of a hydroelectric power station in Kazakhstan, effectively ending his political career. He spent his remaining years in obscurity, dying in 1988 at age 86, largely forgotten by history. Vyacheslav Molotov, the Iron Diplomat's decline. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov, born Skryabin, had been Stalin's foreign minister for nearly 2 decades when World War II ended. His name had become synonymous with Soviet diplomacy, from the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany to the founding of the United Nations. Yet the man who had negotiated with Hitler, Churchill and Roosevelt would find himself increasingly marginalized in the post-Stalin era. Molotov's career stretched back to the early days of Bolshevik power. Born in 1890, he had joined the party in 1906 and worked alongside Stalin in the party apparatus during the 1920s. His loyalty was rewarded when Stalin appointed him foreign minister in 1939, replacing Maxim Litvinov just months before the Nazi-Soviet pact. As foreign minister, Molotov had presided over some of the most dramatic reversals in Soviet diplomatic history. In August 1939, he signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany that shocked the world and enabled Hitler's invasion of Poland. Less than 2 years later, after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, he was negotiating military aid agreements with Britain and the United States. During the war, Molotov became the face of Soviet diplomacy to the Western Allies. He traveled to London and Washington, participated in the Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam conferences, and helped establish the post-war international order. His rigid negotiating style and unwavering defense of Soviet interests earned him the nickname Mr. No from frustrated Western diplomats. The post-war period saw Molotov at the height of his influence. He played a key role in establishing communist governments throughout Eastern Europe, often through manipulation of coalition politics and electoral fraud. In Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland and Romania, Molotov's diplomats worked closely with local communist parties to eliminate democratic opposition and establish Soviet client states. Molotov also represented the Soviet Union in the early Cold War confrontations with the West. He rejected American offers of Marshall Plan aid in 1947, denouncing it as an attempt at economic imperialism. He walked out of the London Conference of Foreign Ministers in December 1947, effectively ending four-power cooperation over Germany. At the United Nations, he used the Soviet veto power repeatedly to block Western initiatives. However, Molotov's influence began to wane in Stalin's final years. The dictator's growing paranoia extended even to his most loyal subordinates, and Molotov found himself increasingly sidelined. In 1949, Stalin arrested Molotov's wife Polina Zemchuzhina, accusing her of Zionist sympathies. Molotov was forced to abstain when the Politburo voted to approve his wife's arrest, demonstrating his complete subordination to Stalin's will. After Stalin's death in March 1953, Molotov initially seemed to benefit from the collective leadership arrangement. He retained his position as foreign minister and was named first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers under Malinkov. However, his rigid adherence to Stalinist orthodoxy put him at odds with the new leadership's reformist tendencies. The clash came most dramatically over foreign policy. While Khrushchev and others sought to reduce tensions with the West and pursue peaceful coexistence, Molotov maintained that conflict with capitalism was inevitable. He opposed negotiations with the United States, rejected overtures to Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito, and criticized any deviation from Stalin's confrontational approach. The break became irreparable after Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956. Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's crimes implicitly criticized all those who had enabled them, including Molotov. When Khrushchev announced a new policy of détente with the West, Molotov openly opposed it, arguing that it represented a betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles. In June 1956, Molotov was removed as foreign minister and replaced by Dmitry Shepilov. However, he remained in the Presidium and continued to oppose Khrushchev's policies. This opposition culminated in the June 1957 attempt to remove Khrushchev from power, where Molotov joined with Malinkov and Kaganovich to form the anti-party group. The conspiracy initially succeeded in obtaining a Presidium majority against Khrushchev, but the first secretary outmaneuvered them by convening the full Central Committee. When Defense Minister Georgie Zhukov provided military aircraft to transport Central Committee members to Moscow, the tide turned decisively in Khrushchev's favor. On June 29, 1957, the Central Committee condemned the anti-party group and expelled its members from the Presidium. Molotov was stripped of all his positions and appointed ambassador to Mongolia, a humiliating demotion for the man who had once negotiated with world leaders. Molotov's exile to Mongolia marked the effective end of his political career. He spent 4 years in Ulaanbaatar, largely cut off from Soviet politics. In 1961, he was recalled to Moscow but was immediately expelled from the Communist Party at the 22nd Party Congress. The resolution stated that his adherence to Stalinism made him incompatible with the party's new direction. For the next quarter-century, Molotov lived in Moscow as a pensioner, officially forgotten but never quite irrelevant. He refused to recant his beliefs or criticize Stalin, maintaining that the former dictator's policies had been essentially correct. In 1984, he was interviewed by Western journalists and defended the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a necessary measure to buy time for Soviet rearmament. Molotov died on November 8, 1986, at age 96, one of the last survivors of Lenin's generation of Bolsheviks. He had outlived Stalin by 33 years, Khrushchev by 15 years, and most of his contemporaries. His funeral was a modest affair, attended by family and a few former colleagues but ignored by the Soviet leadership. The man who had once helped reshape the world had been relegated to a footnote in history. Nikita Kruev. The reformers' triumph and fall. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev's rise to power after Stalin's death was perhaps the most unlikely success story in Soviet history. A peasant's son with limited formal education, he outmaneuvered more sophisticated rivals to become the leader of the world's largest country. His reign would be marked by dramatic reforms, international crises, and ultimately his own downfall. Born in 1894 in the village of Kalinovka near the Russian-Ukrainian border, Khrushchev's early life embodied the revolutionary transformation of Russian society. He worked as a metal worker and mine mechanic before joining the Communist Party in 1918. During the Civil War, he served as a political commissar, beginning a career that would span 7 decades of Soviet history. Khrushchev's rise through the party apparatus was steady but unremarkable. He worked in Ukraine during the 1920s and 1930s, surviving Stalin's purges through a combination of loyalty, competence and luck. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had no involvement in the early factional struggles that destroyed so many old Bolsheviks. During World War II, Khrushchev served as a political commissar on various fronts, including the defense of Stalingrad. His wartime service gave him credibility with the military and first-hand knowledge of the war's enormous human cost. He also oversaw the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, including the brutal suppression of nationalist guerrillas in the western regions. Stalin's death in March 1953 found Khrushchev in a seemingly secondary position within the collective leadership. While Malinkov became head of government and Beria controlled the security apparatus, Khrushchev was named first secretary of the Communist Party, a role that many initially viewed as less important than the others. However, Khrushchev understood better than his rivals that real power in the Soviet system flowed through the party apparatus. As first secretary, he controlled personnel appointments throughout the country, gradually building a network of loyal supporters. While Malinkov focused on government policy and Beria plotted within the security services, Khrushchev quietly consolidated his position. The elimination of Beria in June 1953 removed Khrushchev's most dangerous rival and demonstrated the collective leadership's commitment to ending the era of secret police terror. Khrushchev played a key role in organizing the conspiracy against Beria, showing his colleagues that he could be trusted to work within the system rather than above it. Khrushchev's rise accelerated after Malinkov's fall in February 1955. With his main rivals eliminated or marginalized, he began implementing his vision for Soviet development. His first major initiative was the Virgin Lands Campaign, an ambitious program to cultivate millions of acres of previously unused land in Kazakhstan and Siberia. The Virgin Lands Campaign embodied both Khrushchev's strengths and weaknesses as a leader. His enthusiasm and optimism inspired hundreds of thousands of young volunteers to participate in the project, and initial results were impressive. However, the program was based more on revolutionary fervor than scientific analysis, and long-term sustainability was questionable. In February 1956, Khrushchev delivered the most important speech of his career at the 20th Party Congress. His secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes sent shockwaves through the communist world and began the process known as de-Stalinization. For 4 hours, Khrushchev detailed Stalin's purges, his military blunders and his megalomaniacal personality cult. The speech was intended for Communist Party members only, but its contents quickly leaked to the outside world. The impact was enormous. Communist parties worldwide were forced to confront the reality of Stalinist terror, and the Soviet Union's moral authority as leader of the socialist world was severely damaged. The immediate consequences of de-Stalinization nearly destroyed Khrushchev's career. Protests erupted in Poland and Hungary as communist governments lost legitimacy. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 required massive Soviet military intervention to suppress, resulting in thousands of casualties and international condemnation. Khrushchev's domestic opponents used these crises to challenge his leadership. In June 1957, Molotov, Malinkov, and Kaganovich formed the anti-party group and obtained a presidium majority to remove him from power. However, Khrushchev refused to accept defeat and appealed to the broader Central Committee, which he had carefully packed with his supporters. The Central Committee meeting of June 1957 marked the decisive moment in Khrushchev's consolidation of power. With the support of Defense Minister Georgie Malinkov, who provided military transport for Central Committee members, Khrushchev turned the tables on his opponents. The anti-party group was condemned and expelled from the leadership, while Khrushchev emerged stronger than ever. The period from 1957 to 1964 represented the height of Khrushchev's power and influence. He implemented wide-ranging reforms in agriculture, industry, and administration. The economy performed well during these years, with significant improvements in living standards and consumer goods production. In foreign policy, Khrushchev pursued a complex strategy of peaceful coexistence with the West while maintaining Soviet leadership of the communist world. He met with President Eisenhower at Camp David in 1959, becoming the first Soviet leader to visit the United States. However, the relationship with America remained volatile, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated both Khrushchev's boldness and his ultimate pragmatism. His decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. However, his willingness to withdraw the missiles in exchange for American concessions probably prevented global catastrophe. Despite these achievements, Khrushchev's leadership style increasingly alienated his colleagues. His impulsive decision-making, frequent reorganizations, and unpredictable behavior created instability within the system. His boastful promises about overtaking American living standards seemed increasingly unrealistic as economic growth slowed. The final crisis came in 1964 when agricultural production fell dramatically due to poor weather and policy failures. Khrushchev's opponents within the Presidium, led by Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin, organized a careful conspiracy to remove him from power. On October 14, 1964, Khrushchev was summoned back from his Black Sea vacation to face his accusers in the Presidium. The charges against him included harebrained schemes, immature conclusions, and hasty decisions. Unlike Stalin's victims, however, Khrushchev was allowed to resign quietly and retire with a pension. Khrushchev spent his final years in forced retirement, largely ignored by the Soviet media, but watched carefully by the KGB. He died on September 11, 1971, and was buried in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery rather than the Kremlin Wall, a final symbol of his fall from grace. His legacy remained controversial within the Soviet Union until its collapse, but history has generally judged him as a reformer who began the process of liberalizing Soviet society. Leonid Brezhnev. The era of stagnation. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev came to power promising stability after the tumultuous Khrushchev years, but his 18-year tenure would become synonymous with stagnation, corruption, and decline. Born in 1906 in Ukraine, Brezhnev represented a generation of Soviet leaders who had built their careers during Stalin's rule, but were willing to abandon his methods while preserving his system. Brezhnev's early career followed a typical pattern for his generation. He studied metallurgical engineering, worked in Ukrainian industry, and joined the Communist Party in 1931. During World War II, he served as a political commissar, rising to the rank of Major General. His wartime service provided him with military credentials and connections that would prove valuable in his later political career. After the war, Brezhnev worked in regional party positions in Ukraine and Moldova before being called to Moscow in 1952. Stalin's death the following year created opportunities for advancement, and Brezhnev aligned himself with Khrushchev during the succession struggle. His loyalty was rewarded with promotion to the Central Committee Presidium in 1957. As Khrushchev's protégé, Brezhnev benefited from the First Secretary's patronage system. He served as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet Ceremonial Head of State from 1960 to 1964, gaining experience in foreign affairs and protocol. However, his relationship with Khrushchev gradually soured as the leader's erratic behavior and policy failures mounted. By 1964, Brezhnev had emerged as the focal point for opposition to Khrushchev within the party leadership. Unlike previous succession struggles, this conspiracy was carefully planned and executed with minimal disruption. The plotters included Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin, ideology chief Mikhail Suslov, and KGB chairman Vladimir Semikastny. The coup against Khrushchev was bloodless and bureaucratic. On October 14, 1964, the Presidium voted to remove him from power, citing his voluntarist methods and policy failures. Brezhnev was elected First Secretary, later General Secretary the same day, beginning an era that would last until his death in 1982. Brezhnev's initial approach emphasized collective leadership and policy continuity. Unlike Khrushchev's constant reorganizations, the new leadership sought to provide predictable governance and avoid dramatic initiatives. This approach initially proved popular with both party officials and the general population, who were exhausted by years of upheaval. Economically, the early Brezhnev years showed promise. The Eighth Five-Year Plan, 1966 to 1970, achieved respectable growth rates, and living standards continued to improve. The Kosygin reforms introduced limited market mechanisms into the planned economy, allowing enterprises greater autonomy in production decisions. However, these reforms were gradually abandoned as conservative forces within the party apparatus reasserted control. Brezhnev himself was lukewarm about economic changes that might threaten party control or create social instability. By the early 1970s, the Soviet economy had returned to rigid central planning with increasingly disappointing results. Foreign policy during the Brezhnev years was characterized by the pursuit of strategic parity with the United States and expanded Soviet influence in the developing world. The nuclear arms buildup accelerated dramatically, with the Soviet Union achieving rough equality with American forces by the mid-1970s. The Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, asserted the Soviet Union's right to intervene militarily to preserve communist governments. This doctrine was used to justify not only the crushing of the Prague Spring but also later interventions in Africa and ultimately Afghanistan. Détente with the West, pursued simultaneously with military buildup, achieved significant successes in the early 1970s. The SALT-I Treaty with the United States limited strategic nuclear weapons, while the Helsinki Accords of 1975 seemed to legitimize Soviet control over Eastern Europe in exchange for human rights commitments. However, détente began to unravel in the late 1970s as Soviet activities in Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Afghanistan convinced many Americans that the Kremlin was exploiting improved relations to expand its influence. The invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 effectively ended the era of superpower cooperation. Domestically, the Brezhnev era was marked by increasing corruption and stagnation. The General Secretary himself became a symbol of these problems, accumulating luxury goods, hunting lodges, and expensive cars while ordinary Soviet citizens faced shortages and declining services. The gerontocracy that surrounded Brezhnev reflected the system's inability to renew itself. By 1980, the average age of Politburo members exceeded 70, and many were visibly infirm. Brezhnev himself suffered from multiple health problems, but refused to step down, clinging to power even as his mental faculties declined. The rise of the dissident movement during these years highlighted the gap between official ideology and social reality. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov challenged the legitimacy of the Soviet system, while ordinary citizens increasingly turned to black market activities and private pursuits. Brezhnev's death on November 10, 1982, came as a relief to many within the Soviet leadership who recognized that the system needed revitalization. His funeral was attended by world leaders, but generated little public emotion, reflecting the widespread sense that an era had ended without accomplishment. The Brezhnev era's legacy was deeply ambiguous. On one hand, it provided stability after the chaos of earlier periods and achieved strategic parity with the United States. On the other hand, it represented a lost opportunity for reform that left the Soviet Union increasingly unable to compete with the dynamic economies of the West. The end of an era. The death of Leonid Brezhnev in November 1982 marked the end of the generation that had led the Soviet Union since Stalin's death nearly 3 decades earlier. His successors, first the aged Yuri Andropov, then the even more decrepit Konstantin Chernenko, represented the final gasps of the old system before Mikhail Gorbachev's ascension in 1985 would usher in the final act of Soviet history. The stories of these post-war Soviet leaders reveal the fundamental contradictions of the system they inherited and attempted to manage. Some, like Khrushchev, tried genuine reform but found the system resistant to change. Others, like Brezhnev, chose stability over innovation and presided over gradual decline. A few, like Beria, accumulated enormous power only to fall victim to the very mechanisms of terror they had helped create. None of these men succeeded in solving the basic problems that plagued the Soviet Union: an inefficient economic system, an unresponsive political structure, and a growing gap between official ideology and social reality. Their personal fates, whether exile, execution, or gradual marginalization, reflected the broader trajectory of the system itself. The generation that had fought World War II and built the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe passed from the scene having failed to create a sustainable model for governance. Their successors would face the ultimate test: whether the Soviet system could reform itself sufficiently to survive, or whether it would join other failed experiments in history's dustbin. In the end, the men who had seemed so powerful in their day proved unable to transcend the limitations of the system they served. Their individual tragedies and triumphs were subsumed into the larger narrative of Soviet decline and eventual collapse, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are ultimately shaped by the choices and failures of mortal leaders.